My name is Naomi Speakman.
And I'm Lloyd De Beer.
We're medieval curators here at the British Museum, and we are delighted to welcome you to our new exhibition, Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of a Saint. In it, we tell the remarkable story of the life, death and legacy of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury and thorn in the side of King Henry II of England.
On the 29th of December 1170, Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral by 4 knights from the king's entourage. 3 years later, he was made a saint. The Archbishop's violent death sent shockwaves across Europe, and his story has echoed out down the centuries.
This exhibition takes you on a 500-year journey from 12th century London up to the Tudor court. We begin with Becket's birth and trace his transformation into one of Europe's most popular miracle-working saints, ending with the tumultuous years of the 1500s, when King Henry VIII singled out Becket for attack, declaring him to be no longer a saint, but a traitor to the crown.
We open with a single object that puts the murder center stage, a jewel-like gilded casket enameled in brilliant shades of blue, red and green, on loan from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Zooming into the lower panel, we see Becket standing at the center, facing an altar with his hands in prayer. Behind him, the knights rush in with their weapons drawn, the first driving his sword into Becket's neck. In front of the altar, 2 monks watch on, raising their hands in horror. Above this scene are 2 further images. To the left, a group of mourners lower Becket's body into a marble tomb, while to the right, angels carry his soul up to heaven. This shrine-shaped box is one of the most magnificent of all the earliest known Becket reliquary caskets and was made within 20 years of his death. It originally contained a precious relic of St. Thomas, which now no longer exists, perhaps a blood-splattered piece of Becket's clothing, or even a tiny fragment of his bone. In this one object, the 2 key themes of the exhibition intertwine: the story of his murder and his transformation into a saint.
In the first section of the exhibition, we chart Becket's rise and fall. Turning the clock back to 1120, we explore Becket's birth in London and how this ordinary son of a merchant became one of the most powerful men in the country. We unravel the twists and turns that took Becket from a Canterbury clerk to royal courtier in the household of Henry II, and then finally his surprising appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury. Very few objects owned by Becket survive to this day, and behind me you can see one of them. Now at first glance, this red wax disc may appear humble, but it actually brings us tantalizingly close to the man himself. It is the only surviving impression made from Becket's personal seal, here attached to the base of a document on loan from the National Archives. The device that made this impression was a treasured object, which Becket probably carried with him throughout his adult life. And he would have used it frequently to authenticate documents, so you can think of it as a bit like making his signature in wax. And excitingly, it tells us something of Becket's personality. Around the edge is Latin text, and that reads Sigillum Thomai Lund, which translates as the seal of Thomas of London. And this is how he was known before he became Chancellor and Archbishop, when his title changed to reflect those roles. And it shows that Becket always thought of himself as a Londoner. For the centre of the device, when you're looking closely, Becket would have selected a beautiful Roman gem engraved with a standing male figure, possibly Apollo, and you can see the impression of that at the centre of the seal. Clearly, he was keen to demonstrate his interest in the classical past and styled himself as a man of learning.
Through ability, contacts, and some luck, Becket was appointed Chancellor to the new king, Henry II, and the 2 quickly became fast friends. 8 years later, in a surprise move, Henry selected Becket, his right-hand man, as his preferred candidate to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. This was the most senior church position in the country, and it came with immense wealth and power. Although wary at first, Becket was soon persuaded to take on the role. but his transformation from courtier to archbishop needed some stage management. Becket was not a priest and had shown little inclination for church life. As Chancellor, he was well known for his extravagant lifestyle and had even fought overseas on the king's behalf. Not exactly the behavior expected from a future archbishop. He was consecrated on the 3rd of June 1162, and this alabaster panel, made centuries later for an altarpiece, shows us the grand ceremony. Dressed in blood red, Becket sits between two bishops who place their hands on his mitre, a symbol of his new status. In his left hand, Becket holds another symbolic object, a crozier, his staff of office. Above him, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit preside, indicating that as Archbishop, his new role came with the highest possible endorsement. None of the objects given to Becket remain, but other rare survivals from the 12th century show us what these might have looked like.
Becket's fall from grace was swift. The king's plan was for his friend to continue as chancellor as well as archbishop, but instead of supporting Henry, he renounced the chancellorship and began to oppose the king's authority. Over the next 2 years, Becket was increasingly at odds with the king and became an outcast. With tensions escalating and fearing for his life, the archbishop escaped across the Channel for what would be a prolonged period of exile. In December 1170, after 6 long years away, Becket returned to England. Canterbury Cathedral must have seemed like his last sanctuary, but it would be the stage for his violent death. Within weeks of arriving back at the cathedral, Becket was dead. In this central section, an immersive animation takes you through the drama of Becket's final days in December 1170. The murderers, we know their names, were 4 knights: Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, Richard Brito, and William de Tracy. They had been in Normandy with the king at his Christmas court, and there they had witnessed his frustrated outburst, railing against Becket. Sensing a chance to win the king's favour, the knights hatched a plan together to travel to Canterbury, arrest Becket, and bring him to face justice. After arriving in Canterbury on the 29th of December, things quickly spiralled out of control. Becket refused to leave with them, and a heated argument soon erupted. As the knights left to gather their swords and armour, Becket made his way into the sanctuary of the cathedral. In hot pursuit of the archbishop, the knights followed him into this holy place, and there they struck him down, with one of the sword blows slicing off the top of his skull, and another dashing his brain and blood all over the flagstones. It was a horrific outcome, which left all those in attendance reeling from shock.
Becket was killed during evening prayer, and the cathedral was busy. After the event, 5 eyewitnesses wrote down what they saw, and in a sense, this is as close to contemporary reportage as we can get. The first eyewitness account was a letter composed by John of Salisbury, one of Becket's closest advisors. Copies circulated throughout Europe, taking news of the crime far and wide. One of the earliest known images of Becket's murder precedes John's description in this manuscript on loan from the British Library. Becket is interrupted at dinner by the knight's arrival at his palace in Canterbury. They wait outside the door while a servant announces them. Below, having pursued the archbishop into the cathedral, the knights kill him. Kneeling before his attackers, Becket is struck in the top of his head, while Edward Grimm, who is the only man to come to Becket's aid, stands behind him holding a cross-shaped staff. He receives a blow to his arm. Between Becket and the knights, a piece of the archbishop's bloody severed skull and a fragment from the tip of the murder weapon fall to the ground. In the right-hand scene, devoted pilgrims kneel down before Becket's tomb.
At first, no one knew what to do, and people were terrified that the knights might return. Gradually, however, they started to come forward and gathered up the archbishop's remains. Becket's body was placed on the high altar of the cathedral, where it was left overnight, and the next morning the monks conducted a rushed burial, placing Becket to rest in a marble tomb in the cathedral crypt. Within days, he was said to be working miracles. What began as a trickle became a flood, and hundreds of miracles were recorded. Within 3 years, the Pope made Becket St. Thomas of Canterbury. It was one of the fastest canonizations at the time. Pilgrims from all over Europe came to worship St. Thomas, taking back with them stories of his healing and the magnificence of Canterbury Cathedral. Moving on from the murder, the next section, which I'm standing within, explores the explosion of Becket's cult on an international stage, his reputation as a defender of the rights of the Church, and how the cathedral was rebuilt to house a glittering shrine to hold his remains. Henry was never able to escape his association with the murder. This font, made around 1191 for the parish church of Ljungskile in Sweden, shows how Henry was implicated in the crime. Unusually, he's depicted ordering the knights to go to Canterbury to kill Becket. We see him here enthroned on the left and named by a scroll that projects from his fingers with the words Rex Henricus, King Henry. He points towards a knight who turns to join the others who have already begun their attack. Becket falls down beneath their sword blows, and Edward Grimm remains standing at the Archbishop's side. Produced just over 20 years after Becket's death, this sculpture also demonstrates the speed with which Becket's cult spread beyond England. Becket was popular from Iceland to Italy, and images of him decorated churches across the continent. This stunning golden casket, made in Bergen around 1220, is topped by 2 fantastic dragon's heads that project out from the lid and comes from Hedalen Stave Church in Norway. It shows Becket's martyrdom on the lower panel, where a group of knights attack the Archbishop. Despite being made in Norway, the scene is extremely similar to several of the earliest known depictions from England, with the broken sword point and the top of Becket's skull falling to the floor.
We return to Canterbury and the centrepiece of the exhibition, an entire window of stained glass from Canterbury Cathedral. It is a masterpiece of medieval art and a visual feast for the eyes. This is the first time it has ever left the cathedral, and it provides us with a unique opportunity to see these images close up as never before. It would not have been possible without the collaboration, expertise, and support of our colleagues at Canterbury, and we are extremely grateful to them. On the 5th September 1174, disaster struck Canterbury Cathedral. A fire ripped through the east end, destroying much of its beautiful interior. It prompted a colossal rebuilding project. The finest masons and artists took nearly 50 years to complete the work. Its crowning glory was a new golden shrine made for Becket and situated in a chapel decorated with stained glass, polished stone columns, and a mosaic pavement. Around this shrine, 12 6-meter-tall windows brought Becket's story and his miracles to life. They are the only known representations of his miracles, and they reveal the myriad ways he intervened in the lives of everyday people. Folk from all walks of life, suffering with a variety of illnesses, from leprosy to the loss of eyesight and even, remarkably, castration, are shown being cured by the saint. Most of the glass was made in the early 1200s, but there has been loss, repair, and reordering over the centuries. 7 windows survive in situ, and this here is the 5th in the series. The most sensational story is of a peasant called Aylward, who was accused of a minor theft and sentenced to castration and blinding. The story begins in the panel to the left, with Aylward at the very center. His hands are bound behind his back, and the items he was said to have stolen are tied to his body. A judge, dressed in white and shown wearing a cap, points at Aylward to confer the terrible sentence on him. In the next scene, Aylward, who's now lying in bed, receives a blessing from Becket the day before his punishment. The next day, Aylward is hauled before the judge, where he is pinned down under a plank. A man holds him by the neck and stabs at his eyes. Another, wielding a blade, kneels down and reaches for his testicles. Moving to the following panel, Becket, dressed in red, appears to Aylward in a vision. The saint makes the sign of the cross in front of his face with a staff, and when Aylward wakes the next morning, his eyes and testicles are regrown. He makes a journey to Canterbury, and along the way he shares the story of his healing. Here, Aylward points to his eyes, and a tree between his legs symbolizes his restored fertility. In the final scene, Aylward, like all good pilgrims, arrives at Becket's tomb to give thanks, bending over in prayer.
For hundreds of years, pilgrims like Aylward travelled to Canterbury to worship St Thomas. The most famous of these are Geoffrey Chaucer's fictional pilgrims from the Canterbury Tales, a poem written in the late 1300s that centres on a bawdy group and their springtime trip to Becket Shrine. It begins at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, where the characters spend the night before setting off. To pass the time on their journey, the pilgrims tell a series of tales in a contest set by the innkeeper. On loan from Cambridge University Library, this is one of the earliest complete collections of Chaucer's poetry, dating from about 1400 to 1425. It's full of images of Chaucer's characters, including the wife of Bath, shown here. She's on horseback, carrying a whip in her hand and wearing a voluminous headdress. She was married 5 times and was an intrepid pilgrim, travelling as far as Jerusalem and Spain. Chaucer's poem was left unfinished, and so his characters never made it to Canterbury. But for those real pilgrims arriving at the cathedral, it must have been an otherworldly experience. The church would have been filled with the sounds of chanting, the smell of incense, and there were breathtaking works of art to be seen, not least Becket's extraordinary jewel-encrusted shrine. At the end of a trip, pilgrims bought a souvenir to take home, badges which they wore pinned to their clothing, or flasks which they hung around the neck. The range on offer was remarkable, from images of Becket on horseback, to miniature versions of the shrine, to bells inscribed with St Thomas, and even tiny swords with detachable scabbards representing the murder weapon. These were cheap to produce and transmitted some of the healing power and status of the holy site back to pilgrims' communities.
In the 16th century, Becket found himself again at odds with the crown, but this time it was the Tudor king, Henry VIII. In the final section of the exhibition, we explore how Becket's cult was outlawed and how those opposed to the changes kept his memory alive. For centuries, St Thomas was popular with English kings and queens. To begin with, Henry VIII was no different, and he made the pilgrimage to Canterbury at least 5 times. By the 1530s, things had dramatically changed. Henry broke with Rome, and Parliament declared him supreme head of the Church of England. Becket's status as a defender of church freedoms could not be tolerated, and he was targeted specifically as a traitor to the crown. On the 5th of September 1538, Henry arrived in Canterbury. During his stay, St Thomas's shrine was almost completely demolished. The gold and precious gems were stripped away and carted back to London. The marble base was smashed to pieces. A rumour spread afterwards that Becket's bones had been dragged from the shrine and burnt, with the ashes scattered. 2 months later, a royal order outlawing his name and image followed. It declared that Becket was no longer a saint, and across the country his images were taken down and his name erased from books. Not everyone agreed with the king's demands, and there was a widespread resistance to religious change. These 3 books, from the British Library, Cambridge University Library, and Stonyhurst College, show different approaches to removing Becket's name and image. Here, a prayer to the saint has been carefully cut out of the manuscript, while an accompanying image showing the murder has been left intact. The second is a copy of the Golden Legend, a compilation of saints' lives that was one of the most popular books of the Middle Ages. Here, a woodcut image of Becket's martyrdom and the text for his story have been lightly crossed out with black ink, but both are still clearly legible. The third contains text for Holy Service and was originally used at the Church of St John the Baptist in Bromsgrove, Worcestershire. These pages, where the Mass for St Thomas appears, have been treated aggressively with thick red dye smeared across the text to render it unreadable. Still, the tiny golden initials shine through.
We end the exhibition with these two objects on loan from the British Jesuit province, which show how, despite the tumultuous years of the 1500s, Becket endured. This small oval box contains something precious. Wrapped in red velvet and secured with golden thread, it is one of the few surviving relics associated with Becket. It is held inside a gilded reliquary engraved with the words Ex Cranio Sanctae Tormae Cantuariensis from St Thomas of Canterbury's skull. The relic itself was probably smuggled out of England by a Catholic in the last decades of the 1500s, doing so at great personal risk. It was taken to the Jesuit College of Saint-Omer, where it was protected, and in the middle of the 1600s, a shining silver statue of Becket was made to hold it. Here, St Thomas stands with a sword wedged deeply in his head and one arm raised defiantly in blessing. The two holes at the breast show where the box was attached. Held aloft on a staff, the ensemble was carried in religious processions and served as a material reminder of the ongoing resistance to royal authority, connecting the moment of Becket's medieval martyrdom with the fragile survival of his cult throughout the time of early modern persecution.
Over the course of 500 years of history, we have followed Becket's journey from London to Canterbury and all across Europe. And although our exhibition ends here in the 1600s, his legacy continued. To this day, Becket divides opinion. For some, he remains a martyr and a saint, for others a traitor and a villain. Either way, his is a remarkable life, the story of Thomas of London, born in Cheapside, who defied a king and paid the ultimate price.